Ladies and gentlemen, we did it. A while back, I made the decision that my Twisted Metal Black review was gonna be saved for my 100,000 subscriber special. It was only fitting considering that Twisted Metal Black was responsible for my first hit video, all the way back in the halcyon days of early 2021, though it didn't blow up until late 2021. I'll save the schmoozing for the end of the video for those of you who want to hear it, otherwise, let's get right into it. Twisted Metal Black is the best. There is no competition as far as I'm concerned. It's the best Twisted Metal game and will be extremely hard-pressed to ever have competition in that regard. And I feel like that's especially the case for me. It was simultaneously a reinvention of the series, but also a return to form. However, with that, it's also a game that's lucky to exist and quite frankly shouldn't exist. Let's not mince words. By 1999, after two lackluster sequels, Twisted Metal had seen better days. Brief history lesson. In 1997, Single Track, the developers of the original two games, abandoned their series along with their other creations such as Jet Moto and Warhawk so they could branch off and do their own thing, only for them to be bought out by GT Interactive and subsequently be mismanaged into the ground after a few solid games that made the most of their skill sets. But by the time the company was breathing its last, most of the senior staff had already bailed out one by one. Meanwhile, the company that ended up picking up the slack left behind by Single Track breaking off was 989 Studios, the in-house PlayStation studio that ended up with pretty much every intellectual property that PlayStation didn't have a specifically designated developer for. Cool Borders, Jet Moto, you name it. But then 989 Studios itself went through some struggles in the late 90s and subsequently closed down, relaunched, and closed down again. This could have easily been the end for Twisted Metal, but then the stars aligned. Most of the senior staff of Single Track started a new company, Incognito Inc. Then Sony gave them the license to Twisted Metal, allowing them after only a few short years to pick up where they left off. Which is why this game, despite being very different, is a return to form. So through a convoluted series of happenstance, the Twisted Metal IP ended up right back in the hands of the people who created it, in what was surely a one-in-a-million event. So it's almost as if Twisted Metal Black was destined to be made. And then they went on to essentially revive the waning franchise, and through their unique combination of deliciously dark presentation, fantastic gameplay, and a twist on established lore the likes of which would go on to define the series for years to come, they created a game that's not only the most well-received game in the entire history of Twisted Metal, but also, to my knowledge, it's the best-selling game in franchise history. Twisted Metal Black took the series from its death throes to heights it had never seen, all brought out by one-in-a-million circumstances with a new and improved team of original creators and new blood alike. I don't know if this was intentional, but the series really was back in black. My story with this game isn't really that interesting. As some may know, I didn't actually grow up with the series. In fact, I'm not even sure if I was aware of it back then. Although in mid-2010 during summer vacation, my older brother got a PS3 and handed down all his old PS2 games to me. This included such games as God of War 1 and 2, Devil May Cry 3, Samurai Warriors, Drakengard, and Twisted Metal Black. But I wasn't really a fan at the time, mostly because it was way too hard for me. I didn't understand it, and it seemed too daunting even on easy mode to wrap my head around at the time. It wasn't until one night in October of 2020, when I was drunk, as all good stories start, that I was going through the PlayStation Store and saw that this game was 50% off. So on a drunken whim, I bought it, along with GTA 3 and Vice City, Prototype 1 and 2, and Mortal Kombat X. Once again, I didn't really understand the game. It felt far too daunting for me, but then, as it happens, on Christmas Day of 2020, I finally beat the game 100% legitimately, and something clicked at that point. Suddenly, I found the game not only feasible to beat, but actually very compelling as an experience, and as I continued to beat the game with character after character, I started researching the game and found something that really intrigued me. The mysterious minion who's only unlocked after you beat the game as every other character, and with that came the mysterious loading screen messages that could be deciphered in order to reveal the real story of the game, which was such an intriguing premise to me that I made a video on it, and as they say, the rest is history. Now, several years and 100,000 subscribers later, here we are. And like Marcus Kane's inability to escape from Sweet Tooth's mind, I've never been able to escape this game. It's always wriggled its way back into my sphere of influence, no matter how many other games and franchises I cover. It seeps its way into my subconscious, or more accurately, into my video lineup, because it's one of the most creatively intriguing games I've ever played. Beneath its shooty action and dark exterior lies a hidden depth unheard of in this series, one that's kept me thinking for years. Where do I start with this monster? Well, I think the best place to start would be the theme song. Twisted Metal Black's main theme is Painted Black by the Rolling Stones. Classic rock, as classic as it gets. The main menu even uses that iconic opening guitar lick. This is a song that's been in my musical rotation since I was 15, but until now I never really stopped and viewed the lyrics critically. Based on the lyrics, it's about a grief-stricken man who's lost his love, subsequently falling into a deep depression, and now wants the world itself to be painted black to match his mood, so the world may feel his suffering. I'm not sure if this was intentional, but the man whose perspective the song is sung from is kinda similar to the overarching background plot, with Needles Kane twisting the world into this grim, dark dystopia. You see, if you've never seen any of my other videos covering the topic, the real plot of this game I mentioned just a minute ago is thus. If you unlock Minion and decipher his loading screen messages, it's revealed that Minion is Marcus Kane, the more sane half of Sweet Tooth's split personality, who's trying to stay in the shadows and remain undiscovered. Hence why he can only communicate through code, as he's basically living in constant fear of being lobotomized out of existence. Explaining that the game takes place through Needles Kane's perspective, and everything we see is the world twisted and mangled through the diseased mind of Needles. In his own way, Needles himself is painting his whole world black. Perhaps not as a coping mechanism over a dead wife, at least none that's been established, but there's a clear parallel between the two points of view, wanting everyone to feel the same way they do, and Needles is willing that desire into existence, at least in the sense that we're viewing the world through his perspective in sort of an unreliable narrator situation. The Minion loading screens, and therefore this entire plot thread, was apparently a last-minute addition, but it's a case where I think whatever the intended vision was supposed to be, the slapdash crudeness of this to me is probably much more intriguing than whatever it would have been otherwise, because it leaves enough open to interpretation that the blank space left over gives your mind room to run wild. Hence why I've spent so much time analyzing every nook and cranny of this game's plot from the surface all the way down. Because on the surface level, this is a fairly run-of-the-mill Twisted Metal game, several contestants competing to have their wish granted by ostensibly an all-powerful being named Calypso. The only difference being the absolute grim tone, as well as more involved stories, but then deeper into the abyss you have a plot built on symbolism, interpretation, and an unspoken sense of nothing being as it seems, and it doesn't feel like a lot of this was unintentional either, because there's a line that I've already quoted in Mr. Grimm's story, which is one of the most evocative lines in the game.
They say the mind bends and twists in order to deal with the horrors of life. I think my mind bent so much it snapped in two.
And while you can take that line entirely at face value, it feels like this is an intentional symbolic parallel to the split personality of Needles Kane and Marcus Kane, Sweet Tooth and Minion. When you have an intriguing twist like these secret codes alongside lines like that, I can't help but ask questions about everything. Do the events we see have any bearing on reality whatsoever? Are these events really taking place but with a grim filter over them? Or is this just an elaborate hallucination? Are these characters nothing more than what they seem, or are they each symbolic figures, pieces of the collage that make up Sweet Tooth? Is Marcus really part of the split personality, or is he the psychological representation of Sweet Tooth's ego, with Calypso representing the superego and Needles representing the id? These are outdated concepts as far as psychoanalytics are concerned, but they're still present in a lot of media for how intriguing the concept is. And there are so many other little things that catch my attention about this game, such as how the code to exchange your weapons for health is to hold all the back buttons on the controller and hit triangle X square circle, the movement of which on a PlayStation controller matches the sign of the cross. Almost as if you're praying to be saved from death. Is that just a coincidence, or is this an intentional bit of symbolism? Or the fact that almost every character in this game is noted as having some sort of mental illness. Does that mean something? Does the fact that certain characters don't have a mental illness or don't belong to Blackfield Insane Asylum mean anything? Is there some sort of meaning behind the fact that every character in law enforcement gets screwed over by their endings while everyone who wants revenge gets it, no strings attached? Does it mean anything that the game's manual is presented as a journal taken from the perspective of No-Face? These are concepts and questions that may not interest the people who are looking for a fun game to play, but this is what interests me creatively. Many of these details wouldn't matter in a lot of other games, but it feels like this game opens itself up to the possibility of everything potentially having some sort of external meaning. Hell, I will fully admit that the creators themselves probably never intended for most of these interpretations to be made, so some might throw them out on principle. Personally, I believe that no one should be restricted from interpreting fictional work however they wish. Through history, we can find countless examples of fictional work that are analyzed and overanalyzed again and again beyond any reasonable author intention. So perhaps you view this game at face value, and your take is equally valid. Even if you're viewing this game purely on its own face value, there's a lot to appreciate. The first thing you'll notice literally from moment one is the fact that this game is dark, it's grim, it's bleak, it's f***ed up. The previous games varied in their tone, but were generally lighthearted. I said generally. However, whatever lightheartedness this series had went straight out the window in this entry. The basis of the story is that every, or rather most every character is a member of Blackfield Insane Asylum. That's already a bit much, but then you take into consideration just how heart-wrenchingly messed up the character plots and presentations are. This is a game not for the faint of heart, and while they don't necessarily go as far as they could have, or as far as you'd think at a first glance, this game is the first M-rated game in the series and absolutely earns that M rating. This was of course the game where David Jaffe returned to the game director role, and he's always been, well, let's not mince words, he's a bit weird. He is responsible for some of my favorite games of all time, but he's also a bit weird. Based on interviews I've seen, he's always been the type of creator who's had a fascination with gore and violence and of incredibly dark, crude themes. He practically made a career out of pushing the boundaries of good taste. Hell, from what I understand, the character of Needles Kane, aka Sweet Tooth himself, is based off notorious serial killer John Wayne Gacy. So that should tell you where David Jaffe's mind is at, and Twisted Metal Black is arguably the peak of this mentality, to the point where certain scenes had to be toned down for the game's release. Like, there was a scene in one of the beta cutscenes that included a baby being drowned, which was hastily cut out from the commercial release. There's no way to confirm this, but there's no way that that cutscene was cut for any other reason than PlayStation higher-ups saw the scene and told them to cut it because it was in complete poor taste. And I kind of agree with stuff like that because I kind of feel like you're walking a bit of a thin line with games like this. Because it's very easy for something that's tastefully dark to end up being trite if you're not careful. Like, you're simply trying too hard to be shocking and it comes across as forced. And in that respect, I feel like this game, at least in its full release, is on the sensible side of grimdark, and while it's a shockingly huge departure from the previous games, I enjoy this sort of thing. I find it compellingly camp while also hitting all the right notes of f***ed up when it needs to. And it helps that the various character plots are much more in depth than previous games. For most of these characters, keyword most, you get an establishing cutscene, a middle cutscene where the bulk of the story is established, and a classic Twisted Metal style ending that pays off the plot. Of course, Sweet Tooth is the best produced and best presented plot surrounding his rampages, his capture, his failed execution, and the first and to date only canonical explanation for his flaming head. Well, other than the TV show. When it's established that Preacher put a curse on him to be in eternal torment as penance for the many, many people he's killed. His ending where he rejects the cure and kills Calypso, then drives off into the night, is still my pick for the best ending in series history, and it isn't even close. Brought together by some superb voice acting and writing that rides the line between tryhard and awesome.
I had to decide. It took me all of 10 seconds. Let's face it, boys and girls. A man has to have his priorities.
But then you have some other great stories, such as No-Face and his quest for revenge on the doctor who disfigured him because the doctor placed a bad bet and lost money on No-Face, FKA Frank the Tank, who was a former boxer who got absolutely destroyed. Or you have Mr. Grimm, a Vietnam vet who was forced to eat his own best friend out of some twisted psychological torture method from the advisor to the Vietnamese. Some gold-toothed twat. Now Mr. Grimm, wearing the skull of his best friend, wants nothing more than revenge against that man. Or John Doe, an amnesiac desperate to find out who he was, and he realizes he was an FBI employee who infiltrated a gang who saved countless people just in time for Calypso to cap him. Or how about Outlaw, a SWAT team member who let his hubris get the better of him as he accidentally killed an innocent family in the process of neutralizing terrorists and wants nothing more than to relive that day and undo the tragic mistake that cost him his sanity. All these are brought together by some great visuals and voice acting.
As much as I hated to admit it, over the years I developed a special craving for human flesh.
Son of a bitch even brought his plane with him. Calypso said all I had to do to get my prize was step aboard.
The doc did a good job. I'll give him that. From what I hear, I went a little crazy.
Of course, not all of them are bangers, such as Spectre, aka Bloody Mary, who wants true love, but in the end, even her Franken boyfriend doesn't love her. I understand the point is you can't force someone to love you, but come on, they could have picked a better way to bring that across other than making the entire playthrough effectively pointless. Plus, you can tell that time or budget were running out with the last few characters who get a crudely animated ending at best. Characters like Manslaughter are such interesting concepts, but the lackluster presentation knocks them down a few notches. Still better than the beta cutscenes though. Those beta cutscenes were hit and miss. Some endings are essentially identical, some are changed, and some are hilarious. Like Yellow Jacket having what is obviously stand-in voice acting because just wow.
Promised he'd make everything all better. No! It was a trick! He destroyed my controller and killed my dad!
It's been pointed out that the person's voice acting sounds like Chris Chan, and now I can't get that out of my head. Despite the weaker endings and the clear sense of being rushed, this is probably the most consistently good set of stories and endings in series history. Nothing can touch this. It's the consistency that sells it if you ask me, because this game is nothing if not consistent. Consistently excellent, of course. I think that aside from having the best overall presentation in the series, Twisted Metal Black is also the best game in the series as far as being a game. It doesn't necessarily do anything all that different from the other games. It feels like a refinement of all the previous games and sort of a greatest hits of all the best ideas of the series thus far, brought together with arguably the best controls the series had ever seen. I think the constant struggle of the series up until now is that it was split into two halves as far as controls. First of all, you had the heaviness and attempted realism of the early games, especially with Twisted Metal 2, whereas Twisted Metal 3 and 4 tried to go for something more arcadey and fast-paced. I feel like Black takes the best aspects of both these philosophies into a single package because the controls are very arcadey and fast-paced. You can go from 0 to 100 and back to 0 again in a second. You fly around with the greatest of ease, much like Twisted Metal 3 and 4. But with that said, the controls still feel relatively heavy and tight, much like Twisted Metal 1 and 2. Super tight, in fact. You always feel 100% in control. You can almost always accurately turn and maneuver with pretty well perfect accuracy, so long as you're used to the fast pacing of the action and can keep up with the timing. I don't necessarily know how they married these two aspects, but it feels perfect in that sense. Because if there's one thing to say about the different control methods up until now, it's the fact that a slower paced, more methodical game engine meant that at times it felt like you were fighting against the game in order to get it to do what you want, because your maneuverability is slightly limited by the attempted realism of the engine. Your turning takes longer, when you're airborne it takes longer to get to the ground and regain control. Meanwhile, as was well documented, when you go too far in the opposite direction, like what Twisted Metal 3 did, it felt like you were fighting against the controls for the opposite reasons. Sure, you're moving around quicker, but you're also tumbling around and barely feel like you're in control because of how floaty the game engine is. Like, if you were to take a shot every time you flipped over in that game, you'd be dead in like 5 minutes. Both of these philosophies have their advantages in theory, but by meeting in the middle it means that you get the best of both worlds. Somehow. You can drive past someone, do a 180-degree turn, and be right back in the action without missing a beat. The turning, even when doing a U-turn, is basically perfectly tight, and you barely even slow down. So it's quick, but also completely intuitive. Of course, you do still have instances where you will, for example, flip over, but it's more rare and tends to happen more organically, like having a poor jump. But then, when your 4 wheels are planted on the ground, it takes a hell of a lot for you to lose control or flip over. And if you do, you're basically right back in control instantly. In fact, if you do flip over, instead of waiting for the game to flip you back over, it's as simple as pressing one of the direction buttons to flip back over. These controls go on to make this game mechanically the most tight, responsive, fast-paced, and satisfying game in the series to play. Maybe not by a significant margin, I still think that Twisted Metal 1 and 2 aren't super far behind this one, but this manages to do something completely different from what those two games did while still working impeccably. And I feel like it makes the game very easy to pick up and play. I still think this game has a very stiff difficulty even when compared to the other games in the series, but I feel like this has one of the lowest skill floors in the series. So going from starting up the game for the first time and becoming a consistent Twisted Metal champion comes down to simply getting to grips with the mechanics. It doesn't feel like you have to learn to cope with any quirkiness of the engine or whatever. The funny thing about the game's difficulty, though, is I'm not entirely convinced that the different difficulty settings don't actually change anything substantial. The only difference I found with the different difficulty settings is the amount of times you can refill your health with the refill stations. You can only refill once per level on hard difficulty, twice on medium difficulty, and on easy difficulty you can refill it not once, not twice, but thrice. Otherwise, to be honest, I didn't notice the enemies being any more hard to beat on medium or hard compared to easy, nor do I notice any substantial increase or decrease to the amount of damage you take. So if the health refill is the only thing that changes, I wouldn't be the least bit surprised. It did take me a number of playthroughs to beat this game for the first time, but that was my own fault in hindsight because I didn't understand that these things were healing pads. For a while I assumed that you had to subsist on health pickups, and health pickups didn't spawn all that much, and they also didn't heal you that much. But that's likely to balance out the healing pad, so I guess that's my own fault for not going through the instruction manual before playing the game. Speaking of the healing pad, I've discussed in the past that I feel like Twisted Metal Black is almost a pseudo-remake of the original game because Black brings back a few ideas from that game, this being the chief amongst them, with some other smaller details thrown in, like how in both this game and TM95, Minion is established as the most recent winner of the tournament. Plus, they also brought back Darkseid as a playable character. Then you have several similar levels, like the Highway Loop level being very similar to Freeway Free-For-All, or the Downtown level being very similar to River Park Rumble. I mean, take that for what you will. If this is a pseudo-remake, then that would make sense given that this is a return to form for the original developers, and if that is the intention, it does a good job at hiding it. But even still, despite having some similar content, there's a lot of original, fresh content here. It does what any good sequel or remake or continuation of a franchise should do, and utilizes the new technology to tremendous effect. Of course, fidelity-wise, this game looks better than any previous entry, although I will say I am emulating it and bumping the resolution to 1080p along with applying a widescreen patch and a deinterlacing patch. And emulation does cause a few minor issues, such as the transparency in the loading screens being a bit off. Also, for some reason, my emulator was automatically set to OpenGL, which has major slowdown issues. Thankfully, there's like 6 different other renderers that do better. But even in its default state, this game looks better than any previous entry by a wide margin, which goes without saying, but what they also do is they use the technology to add so much more detail to the game. Whether we're talking about details in the levels, or the characters, the unique animations, the dynamic elements of each level, making them feel much more lively and involved, all the way up to being able to stuff tons of people into every level. with some levels having upwards of 8 characters to take on, and of course they're able to increase the sheer size of every level as well, which surprisingly isn't as double-edged a sword as you'd think for this particular game. Twisted Metal Black has some of the best level design in the entire history of the series. In fact, looking back at my rankings of the levels, 2 levels in this game make it to the top 5, and an additional third makes it to the top 10, 2 of which are massive levels. The exception to that would be Drive-In Movie, which is one of the most compact and exciting levels in the series in that it throws you into a tiny battlefield with the maximum number of players they can fit and tells you to go nuts. It's the most organic of organic challenges they can give you, and it makes for some of the most exciting pulse-pounding moments in series history. Only the absolute best can survive that onslaught. And then you have the other 2, Prison Passage, which is a very unique level for the series in that it starts you off in a small sectioned off area in the middle of a ship where you're facing off against 2 characters with no healing items, no cover, and very few weapons. It's just you against them. It's almost a battle of wits more than it's a battle of, battle. Then after a set amount of time, or after you beat the 2 of them, the walls open up and you have access to the entire ship where you have to fight 2 more people. Then the third and final stage of the level is when you find yourself docking at Blackfield Asylum and you finally have access to the entire level, which is a huge detailed level with so much to explore while fighting a substantial amount of people. Though a funny little detail I noticed is that if you look off into the distance while you're pulling into Blackfield Asylum, you'll notice that the blimp is always to the left of the ship despite the fact that it should be flying over Blackfield Asylum. I believe this is an indication that the ship isn't actually moving. The entire Blackfield Asylum chunk of the level is actually moving towards us, with the boat having some smoke and mirrors effects to make it look like it's moving. Probably because altering the level in real time and having it be moving under the players could cause some catastrophic physics bugs, or at the very least cause the players to jitter around like crazy as their location data is constantly being altered along with the level itself. Either way, it's an ever-evolving level that manages to stay fresh and makes good use of its space despite being huge. And that's something that a lot of levels in the series struggle with, because if you make a big level but don't have enough to fill it with, it ends up being a chore to play in, because you spend more time looking for the action than being in the action, whereas even the biggest levels in this game more often than not fill their space with enough worthwhile additions that it makes the level enjoyable despite its size. The best example of that would be in the penultimate level, Abandoned Skyscrapers. It's an absolute juggernaut of a level which has a bunch of sectioned off areas for you to maneuver between, and each area of the map has something new to offer, whether that be a treacherous rooftop with pits that lead down to spinning turbines, a bridge with a wrecking ball, a chapel, a side area with a bunch of ramps for you to play around in, and an electric barrier that prevents you from falling down. All tied together with 2 things. First of all, the treacherous nature of this level with the various ledges that you have the potential to fall down, killing you instantly, making it a terrible level to play as Darkseid. I made it a game every playthrough to try and trick Darkseid into charging straight off the ledge. I had about an 80% success rate. Then the second thing that ties this level together is the really compelling setting. I feel like the art design in this game is generally really compelling, very grim with lots of desaturated colors and destructive imagery, really selling this world as a complete dump barely holding itself together, while the Twisted Metal contest comes along to tear down what little remains by causing all this collateral damage. But the Abandoned Skyscrapers level sells this feeling the best with its dark, dismal look and being surrounded by what feels like a completely dead city. This is one of my favorite levels in the history of the series, pretty much only being beaten out by the Amazonia level from Twisted Metal 2. It's the level that more than any makes the maximum use of its space and does everything absolutely impeccably. Also, it's responsible for one of the more funny but also frustrating moments I've ever experienced in the series. Let me be clear that this game is usually fully stable, but there's one notably hilarious moment where I was playing as Axel and completely fell through the floor. This is the first and only time that ever happened to me, but I'd be remiss not to talk about it because, I mean, it's hilarious. Though it was also a bit frustrating because many of these levels are hard enough to beat with 3 lives as it is. These are games of endurance in a lot of instances, and if you have a really early death or you make a mistake that costs you a life, In a lot of instances, it's worth it just to cut your losses and restart the whole match because it's better than fighting a losing battle. It's frustrating, but especially in your first couple playthroughs, winning relies on never making mistakes. And in some of these levels, it's pretty easy to make catastrophic mistakes. Either way, these levels that I've covered are only my top 3 in the game. But I don't think there's a single bad level in the game. Certainly some mediocre levels, but nothing that would give me too much pause. I'd say that the worst levels in the game would be Minion Stadium and Highway Loop. The former being simply a disinteresting level in that it's just a basic arena without much going on, with its only notable feature being the fact that you fight Minion there, and the latter only for being a somewhat disinterestingly designed copycat of Freeway Free-for-All. But some other great levels would include Zorko Bros Scrap and Salvage, a fantastic introductory level with a lot of different ideas fit into a relatively small space, including a warehouse and multiple crushing mechanisms. It's action-packed and really starts the game off on a good note. You have the Suburbs, a giant level with a very wavy design fit for catching a lot of air, which includes a ton of interesting level design, including a small city, a carnival, a sectioned off supermarket, and a whole lot of houses for you to drive through. You have Freeway, which is yet another big level bursting with ideas that makes great use of its space with a construction yard, an entire arena, a secret office building for you to drive around in, you name it. Even something like Snowy Roads, which is a level I would rank on the lower end for this game, is still a fun level. Nice and compact, with 2 separate arenas on either end for you to fight in, and the experience is enhanced by the ever-present danger of potentially falling to your death around every corner. Pretty much the only reason I'm slightly negatively disposed to this level compared to the other levels in the game is that it's the level opposite to Drive-In Movie, the aforementioned level, which is one of my favorite in the entire history of this series. Because this game does something that had yet to be done in the series up to this point. Instead of making you play every single level, at 3 separate instances in the story, they let you choose between 2 separate levels, which keeps the story mode at a manageable 6 levels and 2 boss fights, while also giving you the chance to play with a few different variations of story mode anytime you play. Admittedly, you will always play certain levels, hence why, as much as I love it, I am a bit sick of seeing Prison Passage, but this does allow you to experiment and make different choices if you want to experiment. Or if you simply prefer certain levels over the others. Like, for example, as much as I love Drive-In Movie, I would describe it as a level pretty much only for advanced players because there's no healing pad in the level. And that can make it really hard if you're not at the point where you can destroy 8 separate opposing vehicles all attacking you at once on 3 lives with a paltry amount of health pickups at your disposal. Meanwhile, despite not being as good by comparison, Snowy Roads does have a healing pad and even an environmental pickup which activates a lightning storm, which is an easy way to damage multiple people at once. Both of which makes it a much easier ride for new players, and even veteran players can use every advantage they can get, especially because possibly more than ever, enemy AI is pretty skewed against you. On one hand, it keeps things interesting, but on the other hand, it is kind of ridiculous. The enemy AI will more often than not relentlessly attack you and only you. You can't go anywhere without getting pounded in the ass by missiles. I feel like that whistling sound effect that plays when a missile is homing in on you is the type of thing that will give me a psychological complex. Occasionally, they will go after each other, but in a very half-assed way that barely damages each other. You are essentially in a handicap match and are responsible for taking them all out. But thankfully, in most cases, a few volleys of attacks can take out any enemy. In most cases, a few well-aimed missiles or special attacks combined with your machine guns, especially the upgraded machine guns, can easily take out half an enemy's health in one volley. But if there's a few genuine criticisms I can give the AI in this game, first of all, well, it feels like they never run out of ammo. Like they have unlimited missiles, unlimited specials, unlimited ricochets, and so on. Then second of all, it's the fact that they always seem to know exactly what to do at any given time. There were a lot of times where they knew exactly where I was and exactly what I was about to shoot and were able to activate a shield or dodge out of the way in a split second. And then, more often than not, they were also able to perfectly calculate exactly where I was going to be in time for them to hit me with a shot from far away. The point is, the AI is too perfect. It will never make mistakes like an actual player would, and as such comes across as slightly unfair. But then again, I'm the one who has the ability to use healing pads and also have multiple lives, so I guess that's my trade-off. I guess it's simply the fact that constantly dealing with these impossible shots and seemingly never-ending volleys of attacks is more annoying than anything. Like, no matter where you go, you can't get away from it. But I guess that's what you sign up for in games like this, and besides, the balance still is definitely on your side. In fact, if I remember correctly, this game was the first game in the series to give you back all your lives at the beginning of every level. Makes sense, very few people would be able to get through this game on a mere 3 lives, so it's a good practice as to not alienate new players. Veterans of the series may get a little bit snippy about that because they enjoy the extra challenge, but to me it's like those people who genuinely enjoy playing Pokemon Nuzlocke challenges and then complain when a game isn't hard enough to play with that style. Your opinions are valid, but it's much more sensible for a developer to listen to the opinions of a majority rather than a small minority. But then again, enemy AI or level design be damned, most of your enjoyment in this game will largely depend on which character you choose. Because much like any game in the series, the roster is balanced well enough, but there are definitely characters that are easier to play as than others. Whenever a first-timer asks me what player they should start by playing as in this game, I always say Outlaw, because he has good stats, but importantly, his special attack auto-aims. And if you're a first-time player, you want to be focusing on improving your maneuvering skills before you start focusing on accurate shooting. Being able to survive before you can thrive, if you will. And by having a special attack that does relatively decent damage and auto-aims, it gives you an advantage if you're just starting out. I would say my next go-to character would be Sweet Tooth. Obviously, he's the star of the game, so they give him the star treatment, giving him easily the best and coolest special attack in the game. Arguably in the series, where his ice cream truck transforms into a robot and fires off 20 missiles. It's difficult to nail all 20 of those missiles, but if you do, it's devastating. Other good characters to play as would include Roadkill, because his special attack has an auto-tracking ability, but also has a way for you to charge it up, and if you hit somebody with a maximum charge, once again, it's very devastating. It's also not exceedingly difficult to hit somebody with a maximum charge, assuming there's somebody within your line of sight while you're charging, but it does take some finesse. The final character I would recommend a new player play as requires you to unlock him, but Manslaughter is a good car because the explosive dump, yes that's what it's called apparently, while it's somewhat difficult to aim because you need somebody perfectly in your line of sight, if you do hit somebody with it, you're golden. It's absolutely devastating. That's the funny thing about this game if you ask me. The difference between a character that's somewhat easy to use compared to a character that's harder to use is the special ability, because very few characters are so unbalanced in their stats that they're not worth using for that alone. That list basically begins and ends with Mr. Grimm, who has pretty much been the de facto super hard mode from day one. As has traditionally been the case, he has a very powerful special attack, but he also has so little health that it's hard to gain any sort of upper hand. You can't tank anything, and you need to constantly be dodging out of the way all the time. Plus, he's also so fast that he's a bit hard to control. He's not impossible to play as, but he's definitely for the most advanced of advanced players. But otherwise, in my opinion, I think the balance comes down to that element of the special attack, more or less, which would probably make this game one of the more balanced games in series history, because I would say it's something like 80% of the roster I can pretty consistently beat the game with. And that's just me. I'm sure there are a lot of people out there who are better than me who can easily beat the game consistently with every character. But otherwise, I would consider this roster of characters much more fair and balanced than many other games in the franchise. Even if you do pick one of the characters with a slightly more difficult to use special attack, Darkseid, you can still mostly rely on the roster of standard weapon pickups. It definitely has everything you'd want. I would say that Twisted Metal 3 and 4 were a bit bloated in that regard, adding far too many weapons to the game that felt somewhere between superfluous and useless. Meanwhile, I think that Black is the best of both worlds, bringing back only the main staples while also adding a few unique weapons to this game that intelligently mixes things up, such as the gas canister, which sort of replaces the napalm from previous games. It's a launched explosive, but one that you choose when it drops and explodes. They also introduced the Mega Guns, which temporarily upgrade your standard machine guns to devastating effect. I'm not kidding when I say if you can nail an entire volley of mega gun bullets to one of your enemies, it's devastating first of all, and satisfying as hell. Then you have the 3 separate special missiles. You can only have one of them at any given time as they take up the same slot, but they each do something unique. The Zoomy missiles fires 10 ultra-fast missiles one after another, which gives you a bonus if you land all 10. The reticle is a charging missile that fires more missiles depending on how long you can keep someone in your sights before firing, and the satellite, which is a series of missiles that rains down upon a point about 6 feet in front of you, and so you need to have someone super close to use it. My favorite addition, however, is the aforementioned environmental pickups, which sort of replaces the lightning pickups from the previous games. The environmental attack is unique to whatever level it's available in, and more often than not results in a lightning attack, but it also diversifies itself. In one level you'll have a helicopter attack, in another level you'll have a dilapidated bomber launch a bunch of missiles. You never know quite what you're gonna get, and that's what makes it inherently more interesting to me than the lightning pickups. But whether you're dealing with the new attacks or the old attacks, every weapon has its usage and packs a punch to use, really selling that fast-paced kinetic action that the series is known for, possibly better than ever. Though for what it's worth, the defensive powers are a bit of a step back. There's only a small handful of them, and none of them are really worth using outside of the freeze attack, if you ask me, because at least the freeze attack gives you a free shot. Otherwise, the other defensive powers are a bit situational, and what's funny is, the codes are maybe a bit too easy to use because I kept accidentally dropping mines without meaning to. Also, they added the extra addition of having to hit the fire button after typing in the code to rear fire, which I'm not a fan of, because I find that it adds an extra momentary setback which could potentially be the difference maker as far as making the shot or missing the shot. So long story short, if there's one thing about this game that I will consider a bit of a step back, it's the defensive powers, although some people also don't seem to like the bosses. I personally think the bosses in this game are great, those being Minion and Warhawk. The Minion boss fight is really inconsistent, to be fair. The whole idea is you're supposed to damage 4 separate panels on Minion in order to disable the force field so you can damage him. The inconsistency in difficulty is always tied to that back panel because it's very hard to get Minion in a position where you can hit him in the ass. That's just the way these things go, so it's mostly down to luck. There was one point where I spent 10 minutes trying and failing to hit the back panel, which frustrated the hell out of me, but then I got a game over and pretty much immediately took out all 4 panels in my attempt after that. What was the differentiating factor? I don't know. I was honestly very close to turning on this boss fight because I have long since considered it one of the better boss fights in the series. But then in pretty much every subsequent playthrough, I managed to pull it off just fine, and it kind of reminded me of what I like about the boss fight, which is that it's very uniquely skillful. Almost every fight in the series can be won through sheer brute force, whereas this one is one of the rare instances of having to use a bit of strategy and craftiness. When it comes to the genre of car combat, I like bosses that get more creative, because while it's perfectly acceptable for a boss to be just a bigger enemy with more health, there's no creativity to that if you ask me, so I appreciate bosses that use the mechanics to force you to think outside the box. It's a bit unique, but it's still absolutely a test of everything you've learned up to this point. Still, there is a random nature to this, so I can't hate it, but I can understand if somebody does. Then there's Warhawk. The idea is that you have to use the explosive tankers to gradually damage and then disable Warhawk's shield before you can damage Warhawk himself. Or itself, as the case may be. I'm not sure if Warhawk is considered the name of just the ship, or the guy flying the ship, like it's a nickname or something. I will acquiesce to the fact that Warhawk can be pretty obnoxious to fight with certain characters, because certain characters' special attacks are not designed to be able to hit a flying enemy, but I still appreciate it for the fact that it's able to mix things up even more than Minion. In fact, this is probably about as different as you can get without leaving the genre entirely. So having to use the various tankers to disable Warhawk's force field with explosions is a really creative way to mix things up. I feel like that counts for a lot. If you disagree with me, fair enough, but that's just my opinion, take that for what you will. That's the thing about Twisted Metal Black. I'll say that it's not for everyone, but it really does feel like a game that was almost specifically made for me. It has sublime gameplay mixed with a presentation and a series of stories that just click with me in a way that few games have. Combine that with stellar controls, fantastic level design, and great variety, and you have a game that's pretty close to perfect for what it is, if you ask me. But if there is one thing I can knock this game for, it kind of irreparably altered the series' reputation in a sense. Not in a negative sense, but in a notable sense. Let me tell you a story. A while back, I was streaming one of the early Twisted Metal games to my friends on Discord while I was recording it for a video. I don't remember which one. One of the people I was streaming to has issues with gore, and so said he wasn't going to be watching me, and I was taken aback at that because other than Twisted Metal Black and 2012, that's not actually representative of the series. But the issue is, the two notable examples of games in the series that have that grim tone and the gory presentation are Black and 2012. The most popular game in the series, and the most recent game in the series. And it doesn't help that many crossovers involving Sweet Tooth have his 2012 presentation at the forefront. So while Twisted Metal Black is my favorite game in the series, it is kind of misrepresentative of the series overall. And yet it's the type of game that the average person will associate with the series more than any. And that is unfortunate because it's potentially alienating for a lot of people. Because I feel like this type of thing isn't everyone's cup of tea. Some people prefer a more lighthearted experience, which the series does provide, but many may not know that. And it's funny because at this point, one game did come out after TMB that was more in line with the original vision of the series, and yet this is still the tone that stuck. I remember once upon a time in a different life, I coined the concept of the Twinsanity effect, which I described as an instance where a long-running franchise will shift severely in tone, which thereafter becomes the tone the series is both known for and is presented with, almost as if it was always like that. Vis-a-vis the Crash Bandicoot series from Twinsanity onward. But this is almost the inverse of that, where despite the series having examples of both classic style and TMB style, TMB is still what the series is known for. It's odd and a bit unfortunate, but at the very least, fans of the series will know that Twisted Metal Black and 2012 are the exceptions and not necessarily the rule. But that is something I would like for the people who are watching this who may not be familiar with the series or as familiar as I am to keep in mind. If you decide to skip out on the series because you saw this specific game and thought it was a bit much for you, there are at least 6 different games that might be better suited for you. But Twisted Metal Black is my kind of game. It's an experience that hits all the right notes and appeals to all my tastes. And it's funny because I've literally had people in the past tell me that I'm obviously just going with herd mentality when I say that this is the best Twisted Metal game. I'm obviously just lying to myself when I say I don't like things like Twisted Metal 3 or 4. Well, I'd like to think that I've pretty thoroughly explained my opinion, so hopefully I can tell anybody who wants to accuse me of misinterpreting my own opinion to shove it. But I do feel like my affection for this game goes a bit deeper than even what I've said up to this point. In a weird way, I feel like I owe a lot to Twisted Metal Black, as weird as it may sound. Because it may not be my favorite game of all time, but it's one of the more important games I've ever come across, mostly because during the time in which I made the original video on this game back in early 2021, I was going through a lot of personal and creative burnout from a combination of the pandemic as well as personal projects I'd been working on not working out. And while I did make a video on Rift Apart before that one, I'd mostly made that video out of a desire to see something I once loved improve. But actually making that video made me physically ill because I was so burnt out I couldn't even look at editing software. Whereas I made the original Twisted Metal Black video on this channel out of a sense of creative interest, something I hadn't done in a while at that point. So I felt like this game kind of renewed my creative interest back in 2021 and in a sense is kind of responsible for a lot of this channel. I'm sure I would have eventually found that creative spark again, but I do, at least in this timeline, owe a lot to Twisted Metal Black. It's the game that gave me my creative spark back. And I feel like that's why I will keep coming back to it until I find every possible bit of meaning or symbolism I can get out of it. Aside from being a fantastic game in its own right, in near enough every possible way, this is a game that has a lot of personal meaning to me, despite the fact that I haven't really been playing it for all that long. Alright, so I figured I'd get on camera for this last bit. Funny story, I actually hung up this green screen a couple years ago when I moved in, and Just never had a reason to use it up until now. I kind of just assumed I was going to eventually use it, but I never did. Also, I'm sure a lot of people are going to be like, oh my god, face reveal. Like, nah, I've done like 8 face reveals. First time you see me like this, but, you know, that's a different story. So yeah, I'll try to make this quick, but I just wanted to get on camera and kind of say my piece. Kind of, you know, because it's not every day that you hit 100,000 subscribers or you hit a major milestone generally. So, yeah, you know, when I started this channel back in early 2021, it was kind of started as an experiment. You know, maybe 1/10 of you might know that I had a channel before this one that I ran for a couple of years that never really worked out, and I kind of really grew to dislike that channel. And kind of one of the things I wanted to do with this one, this new channel, was kind of do everything the complete opposite that I used to do. Whether that be, you know, keep things completely, like, fat-free, by which I mean just don't say anything that doesn't need to be said, you know, it's just like cut everything down to the bare basics. And, you know, I didn't want to do videos that were done just for the sake of being videos, you know, I didn't want to just do straight-up reviews. Now, I've kind of gone back on that a few times, but the point being that I wanted to do topic-based videos instead of, like, videos just for the sake of talking about a game, you know, it's kind of one of those things that I wanted to focus on. And the funny thing is this channel was never actually meant to last. Like, I was initially planning on, you know, using this channel to springboard into bigger things, but that never ended up happening because I kind of realized over time that this channel had some legs to it, and that people were, you know, digging the things that I was putting out. And, you know, now here we are at 100,000 subscribers, and holy shit, like, it's one of those things that, like, you know, in the grand scope of YouTube, you know, there's some people out there who have like 50 million subscribers. That's cool, but like, just 100,000 is a fucking lot to me, and I never thought I'd hit that in my wildest dreams. And, you know, I can't thank you guys enough. You know, I kind of just decided at some point that I was gonna, you know, ride this channel until the wheels fell off. And, you know, maybe I've already peaked. Maybe this is as good as it gets. But, you know, even if the channel dies tomorrow, I can live with the assurance that I did something that I never thought I'd be able to do. And, you know, I couldn't have done it without you guys, because, you know, without you, there is no me. And you know, I do feel like sometimes a bit of a scumbag, because, you know, I'm not a very social person, so I don't really interact with my fans all that much, and I kind of, sometimes I feel like I kind of take my fans for granted. I remember when one of my patrons, God004, when he kind of sent me a care package with a bunch of games, including a long box copy of the original Resident Evil, I thought to myself, well, damn, like, people actually care this much. And sometimes I feel like I don't put in as much effort and as much appreciation as I could, but I do very much appreciate, you know, every fan that I have. And, you know, sometimes it's easy to forget that. It's easy to forget that, you know, there are thousands of people out there who do give a damn, because, like, you know, it's easy to get caught up in the negativity. Basically, you know, it's not all been positive, but for every one negative thing that's happened, like 100 positive things have happened, and, you know, it's easy to get caught up in the negativity. But at the end of the day, I reached a milestone that I never thought I'd be able to reach, and it's all because of you guys. So I just want to say thank you. The best is still yet to come. You know, I still have a lot of ideas in this bald ass noggin. So, you know, just stay tuned. Alright, so since I'm on camera already, I'll just say, if you like this video, and want to support the channel, you can like this video, leave a comment telling me what you think, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. And if you want to support the channel in a more direct fashion, you can pledge to my Patreon for unique perks and rewards such as early access, Discord benefits, and exclusive content along with these fine folks scrolling past me right now. Alright, my list is over there. And an extra special thank you to Brooklyn, Dick Kickham, Gaw004, FarmCat84, Raph, Ranger X, Ty Trovey, Weird Webster, and Monster Thenardier for going above and beyond. Elsewise than that, I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you guys next time. Stay crispy, my friends. Well, that was awkward.